but caught her in the mouth instead. Her teeth shattered with a nasty crunch he could hear even over the collective moaning of the crowd, and she staggered back. Nate advanced on her again, and this time got her right above the ear, dropping her into the mud. They were all around him, a blur of faces. Nate didn't stop moving. He knew stopping would get him killed, and he had no intention of dying just yet. He twisted away from another zombie, put his hand in a woman's face to block her snapping teeth from his neck, and pushed on. One of them got its fingers caught up in the tattered clothes hanging around Nate's waist, and he had to spin around in circles to try to throw the zombie off balance. "Let go," he said, and slapped at the zombie's arm with his weapon. But the zombie's grip was strong, and when Nate finally shook it loose, it came away with a muddy clump of his shirt in its fingers. "Fucking bastard!" Nate screamed, and swung his blackjack overhand, coming down on the zombie's head. It hit with a crack as the scalp split in two and fell away from the skull. At the same time, more hands were reaching for him. Nate hit one of his attackers in the face with the club. It was an awkward swing, and he lost his footing in the slick mud. He landed on his side and felt the air rush out of his lungs. He gasped for breath and was still fighting to pull air into his lungs as he scrambled away on his hands and knees. A moment later, he was on his feet again. There was a gap between the two zombies directly in front of him, and he ran for it. They clawed at his face, but he didn't let them slow him down. The red man's platform was less than 100 feet away now. He was close. A man tried to wrap his arms around Nate's neck, but he ducked and twisted around, coming under the tackle. Nate swatted the man in the groin with a blackjack and almost laughed at the grunt that came from him. The zombie pitched over forward, but didn't stop. He kept kicking its knees at the earth, swaying from the blow, trying to climb back to his feet. But if he ever made it, Nate didn't know and didn't care. He was already pushing his way toward the platform again, pushing bodies aside, swimming over those he couldn't move and crawling like a worm under them. Then, there was daylight again. He was through the crowd and standing at the foot of the metal stairs that led up the front of the platform. Nate stumbled up the first few steps and stopped. He looked back. The zombie crowd was a riot, slowly pushing itself toward his position. He stood there, his chest heaving, watching them surge forward, not quite believing that he'd come this far. It didn't seem possible, even though his body was screaming from 1,000 cuts and bites and scratches. "Nate!" He looked up. That was Avery's voice. He turned away from the crowd and started up, crashing into the railing like a pinball as he tried to clear his head. The zombies hadn't killed him, but they had torn into him, and his mind felt like a soupy mess from the pain. He was still 4 or 5 steps from the platform when he saw the red man staring down at him, his bloodshot eyes seeming to blend in with the paint on his skin. But Nate could still recognize the look of shock on the red man's face. The red man looked at the stub of his finger, and then at Nate. "You," he said. "That's not possible." "I guess this ain't your day," Nate said, and raised his blackjack. He was about to swing when a woman stepped in front of the red man and fell forward into Nate's arms. Nate stumbled backward a few steps while struggling to keep the zombie at arm's length. Only then did he recognize Sylvia. The side of her face was a mixture of fresh and dried blood, the frizzled gray hair there matted and sticky. Her mouth curled down at one side where the lip was busted. Her teeth were red with blood. "Sylvia," Nate said. "No." She snarled and lunged for him, teeth snapping. He was caught off guard, and she nearly got his upper lip. But Nate recovered in time to throw her to one side. She staggered, caught herself on the railing. Nate punched her in the nose with his free hand and knocked her off balance enough for him to get his foot up to her chest and kick. She tumbled down the stairs and into the arms of the zombies coming up from the field. Nate headed back up the stairs, the blackjack raised high. He swung with everything he had, but the red man had the advantage of height, and he blocked it by throwing his left forearm across Nate's wrist. Nate teetered on the stairs, off balance. The red man lowered his arm, and then hit Nate in the mouth with a fierce left jab. Nate's vision turned purple for a second, and he felt his legs turn to water. He couldn't remember ever being hit so hard, and as he started to fall backward, he pleaded with himself to keep his feet. Keep his feet. But it was no use. His body wouldn't cooperate, and he fell over. A pair of arms fell on his shoulder, and Nate blinked up at the torn and bleeding man who held him fast. "Ben!" Nate said. "Oh, Ben." But this wasn't Ben anymore. The body was the same, but the eyes were vacant and dead. His face was a crisscross pattern of dried cuts, and there were deep bite marks all over his arms and legs. He staggered toward Nate, a gurgle in his throat as he pawed at the space between them. Nate tripped on the stairs and landed on his butt. Then his eyes caught a flash of something protruding from the holster on Ben's hip. His pistol. The next few moments were a blur. Nate reached for the gun and pulled it. His gaze fell on Ben's dead eyes, and he said, "I'm so sorry, Ben. You deserve so much better than me." The shot. Ben's head snapping back. A spray of blood and bone and bits of hair flying out behind Ben's head, covering the zombies behind him. Ben's body flying backward, knocking the zombies there down like bowling pins. The echo of the shot rolling over the open field, drowning out the moans. Then Nate looked down at the gun in his hand, and for the first time in his life, he knew without a doubt what he had to do. He turned and headed up the stairs. Avery was huddled against the railing in the far corner. The red man was standing in the middle of the platform, staring at him. "Put the weapon down, or they will kill you," the red man said. Nate didn't answer. He stepped forward and raised the pistol. "Stop! You're a dead man if you do this." Nate smiled. "You're wrong. I just started living." He fired twice, hitting the red man in the chest and sending him backward, his arms pinwheeling madly. The red man landed with his back on the railing, his bloodshot eyes staring up into the rain, his mouth opening and closing, as though he were trying to speak, but couldn't get the air in his lungs to do it. Nate closed the gap between them and fired again, this time hitting the red man in the crease between his nose and upper lip. The red man's head snapped back just as Ben's had, and he died, curled backward over the top railing, body slack, his arms spread wide and hanging into the open air, rainwater dripping from his fingertips. Nate stared at him, fascinated. The whole world seemed frozen around this moment, and for a long time Nate had the feeling he was floating through a forest in Pennsylvania, a patch of daylight at the edge of the trees looming ever closer, his lungs bellowing in his ears, the feel of daylight on his skin and its warmth welcoming, like it would pull out of all this death and propel into a world that finally made sense. A moaning from behind him shook him from the reverie. "Nate!" Avery said. He looked at her, and then followed her gaze toward the stairs. Sylvia, bloody and vacant-eyed, was standing there. "Back away," the man said. He waved Nicky toward the port side with the barrel of his pistol. "Over there." Nikki glanced over her shoulder, where the zombies were wading into the river. There wasn't going to be much time, and she was only going to get one chance to do this right. But his gun hand was just out of reach. Maybe a kick, she thought, then dismissed that idea. The man's eyes were hard and calculating. He looked ready for something like that, almost like he was hoping she'd do it. He had orders to get her to the Red Man. She was certain of that. But a part of her couldn't help but wonder if he really cared about orders. Was he just looking for a reason to put a bullet in her? She thought so. And she was not going to die that way. "Move it!" he said. Okay, she said, and stepped where he wanted her to go. He got the AR-15 from the captain's chair and laid it down in the puddle of blood on the deck. He was smart about that, at any rate. Only an amateur would try to use a rifle in the close confines of the boat. But then she looked at his face again, at the blood crusting in his beard, at the pink rivulets of blood-stained rainwater dripping from his chin. "You don't care about the Red Man," she said. She could hear the moaning over her shoulder. The zombies were getting close now. The man didn't look at them, though. Instead, he smiled at Nikki, playing the game with her. He wasn't going to betray his fear by looking at the zombies, gauging the distance. He went on smiling, and the look seemed to say, "Fine, you want to play chicken? Let's play." "You don't serve him because you care about what happens here," Nikki said. "You do it because you're scared." "That's it, isn't it? You're scared." The smile slid away from his face. She took a quick glance to her right. The first 3 zombies were less than 10 feet away now. "That is it. You're scared. That's why you played dead, isn't it? You weren't trying to trick me. You were hoping to slink away like a coward. I thought I saw the killer in your eyes, but that isn't you, is it? You're just a coward." "Bitch! You're gonna get a bullet in your head." "Then do it!" she snapped. "Come on, coward! Do it!" The rain fell. They stared at one another, and for a moment she thought she had him. But then the smile came back, sinister and cruel. "No," he said. "Not yet." He flicked the barrel toward the captain's chair. "Over there. You're going to drive us over to the platform." "Just like that? You don't want to play anymore?" "Nobody's playing any games here." He motioned to the chair again. "Move!" She shrugged, then walked over to the chair, but didn't sit down. She focused on the sound of the rain pattering against his coat, gauging his location. He was behind her, just a little to her left. Just about perfect. Suddenly, she rocked forward, simultaneously throwing a mule kick in his direction. But something was wrong. Her aim was true. She had gauged the distance right. She should have connected. Only the man wasn't there. He had sidestepped her at the last second, and now he was right up on her, one hand balled in her hair, the other jamming the barrel of the gun into her broken ribs. She screamed from the pain, unable to control it. He pulled her away from the captain's chair and threw her onto the gunwale so that she was bent over the side, her face right above the weeds poking out of the water. "You want to play games with me, bitch? Huh? That what you want?" He pulled back on her hair so she could watch the zombies closing on the boat. "How's this? Let's see how you like this." She tried to kick and buck him off her, but he jabbed the barrel into her ribs again, and her legs turned to water. But she had to act. The zombies were almost on them, closing in. She bent her knees slightly, just enough to get some leverage against the floor. He was leaning over her, using his weight to pin her over the gunwale. As soon as she felt the gun pull away from her ribs, she jumped up and forward, carrying him on her back over the side of the boat. He let out a grunt of confused panic as he splashed into the water and weeds. He came up spluttering. But Nicky didn't give him a chance to react. She swatted the gun from his hand, and then grabbed the sides of his head and jammed her thumbs into his eyes, digging into the oozing jelly with everything she had. He screamed and grabbed her wrists, but there was no strength in his hands. His whole body seemed to tense and then sag into itself. Nicky shook his hands loose from her wrists and pushed him into the approaching zombies. His screams started anew as she backed away. He was still screaming when they pulled him down into the weeds, a dark red shadow spreading out from the huddle. She stood there, trying to catch her breath, eyes tearing up from the pain in her side. A shot echoed across the river, and Nicky turned sharply toward the platform. It was followed by two more, and then a fourth. "Avery," she said, and jumped into the captain's chair. Sylvia pulled herself up the stairs. She could barely stand and had to lean on the railing for support, but she kept coming, wobbly legs shaking beneath her. Her moaning was a choppy, breathy gurgling, like there was fluid in her throat. There was unmistakable hunger in her eyes, though. Behind her, the stairs were crowded with zombies. The entire field was closing on the platform now. Nate raised the pistol and sighted it on Sylvia's forehead. "Nate, no!" Avery shouted. "That's not Sylvia," he said. "Don't!" She shook her head, pleading with him. He lowered his pistol and pulled her to the back of the platform, next to the red man's corpse, his eyes still open and staring up into the rain. Far out on the river, Nate could see the red man's fleet coming back to the hotel docks. He looked down at the water 2 stories below and shook his head. With the way his head was swimming, he doubted he could clear the short stretch of grass between the platform and the water. "Avery, we're gonna have to jump." She looked over the railing, her face stricken. "I can't." "We're gonna have to. We can't go anywhere else." Sylvia tripped on the last step and fell to her hands and knees on the platform. She looked up at them and groaned, then slowly climbed to her feet. Nate turned to Avery. He gestured with the gun. "She wouldn't want to be left like that." "Don't," Avery said again. "Please don't. I couldn't bear that." "All right, then. Climb over the railing. I'll cover you." Avery was climbing the railing when Sylvia let out a long, stuttering moan. Both Nate and Avery turned toward her just as a shot rang out, and Sylvia's head snapped back. She folded to the ground. "Sylvia!" Avery screamed. Avery tried to reach out for the dead woman, but Nate grabbed her by the hips and pulled her back. More zombies were already mounting to the top of the stairs. They were running out of time. He turned toward the river. Nicky was down there, looking up at them over the sights of a rifle. Her face looked twisted, and he could read the pain there, even through the rain. "Jump!" she yelled. "Avery, you have to jump right now!" Nate put a hand on her butt to help her over. "Come on, Avery. You got it." To his surprise, she didn't need much coaching. She went over, hung on the railing for just a moment, and then jumped for the water. She landed hard, but the next instant she was up. 2 more shots rang out, and Nate turned to see 2 more dead zombies at the top of the stairs. He looked back to the water where Nicky was lowering her rifle. "Come on!" she hollered. "Your turn!" Nicky rushed into the water and grabbed Avery's hand. "Baby, you okay?" The girl's eyes were red from tears. "Sylvia's dead," she said. "I know, baby. Come with me, please. We don't have much time." Slowly, too slowly, Avery took her hand. Nicky pulled her into the river. the water rapidly climbing up to their waists. Out on the river, the red man's fleet was coming closer. The boats were big, and the crews well armed, but they were slow. There was no way they'd catch the little speedboat. All they had to do was get a small head start. They reached the boat, and Nicky helped Avery climb in. "You got it?" "Yeah," Avery said. Her voice was a strained grunt as she tumbled over the gunwale. Nicky turned back to the platform. She could see the red man dead on the railing, and she thought she should be glad for that. But the cost had been so damn high. She choked back her tears for Sylvia and climbed into the boat. With a little extra height, she could see over the platform's railing. Nate was backing away from a growing crowd of zombies. Even from the water, she could see the cuts and bites all over him, and she marveled that he was still on his feet. Clearly, he was made of stronger stuff than she'd given him credit for. "Nate!" she yelled. "You have to jump!" He fired the pistol, but the shot went wide of the mark, hitting one of the zombies in the shoulder and spinning it around, but not dropping it. Zombies closed in around him. Nicky looked back toward the river and saw the black-shirt fleet closing in. The head start she'd been hoping for was rapidly disappearing. Another 30 seconds, and they'd have the little speedboat surrounded. "Nate, goddammit, you have to jump! Now!" A woman climbed over the bodies at the top of the stairs and staggered toward Nate. There were lesions around her eyes, the pupils like black, glassy discs in a sea of bloodshot infection. She snapped at him, drawing his attention toward the ulcerated skin around her mouth, the skin there green and crusty around the holes in her cheeks. He raised his weapon to fire at her, but she was too fast. She was on him before he could pull the trigger, raking her fingernails across his face and his hands, and the pistol went flying. He grabbed her wrists and twisted one way, and then the other, trying to throw her off balance. But she wouldn't budge. 2 more zombies hit him from the right, and their combined weight was enough to throw all of them to the floor. Nate twisted away, but he was off balance, and his head slammed into the railing. He fell to his knees, bright lights going off behind his eyes as he struggled to regain his feet. "Nate!" Nicky yelled. "You have to jump! Now!" The woman with a diseased mouth piled onto Nate's back, biting at his bare flesh. He shook under her, staggered to his feet, and poured himself over the top of the railing. He tried to hold on, to control his fall, but his head was spinning. His fingers wouldn't grab at the rail. And then he was falling, tumbling in space. He hit the ground on his bad ankle and heard something crack. The pain shot through him like a lightning bolt, and for a moment, that was all there was. Blinding, mind-crippling pain. Nicky's voice broke through the pain first. He rolled over, disoriented, trying to spot her. The whole world seemed to be moving like the horizon as seen from a ship at sea. Images flashed in front of him. The back of the platform, the lacework pattern of crisscrossing metal beams shaking beneath the weight of so many zombies. Figures lumbering toward him, splashing clumsily through the water. Others falling from the top of the platform, dropping like lemmings from a cliff all around him. He could feel the water at his back, and he pulled himself that way, but it was so hard to keep his head above the pain. It was like a wave threatening to overtake him and pull him down. Faces were all around him. He heard coughing and felt hands on his back, gripping at his arms. Then he blacked out. Chapter 31. Nicky lowered her rifle. "Help him!" Avery shouted. She was hysterical, screaming in Nicky's ear. "Do something!" "I can't get a shot," Nicky said. She raised her rifle again, squinting through the sights, but there was no way she could squeeze off a shot like this. Not while the little boat was rocking in the current, and Nate was up there getting mobbed. She was good, but she wasn't that good. She knew that. and she already had one friend's blood on her hands.
"Nate!" she yelled. "You have to jump! Now!"
Up on the platform, Nate was struggling to get back on his feet. The man was a fighter, that was plain. He managed to get his feet under him and pushed up to a crouch. Then he buckled again and pitched forward, hitting his head squarely on one of the railing's post bars. But he didn't go down. He kept pushing, and somehow managed to spill over the top of the railing. She watched him fumble for a handhold, miss, and tumble to the ground below. He landed badly. Nicky knew he was hurt from the way his leg folded under him. The ankle, she thought, with a strange clinical detachment. Broken. Has to be. Avery had both hands on the gunwale, and she was screaming Nate's name over and over again. Nicky stepped forward, raising her rifle as she came. Zombies were coming around both sides of the platform, and more were falling from the top. Too many. Nicky fired again and again, dropping at least 8, but it was a losing battle. There were just too many.
"We have to help him,"
Avery said. Nicky met her gaze, shocked at the look on Avery's face. Nicky knew well the panicked animal flicker that sometimes darkened Avery's expression. She had seen it often enough during those terrifying early days when they first found themselves all alone. But this was something new. The look in her eyes wasn't panic or fear, but fierce determination, and banked beneath it, defiance. She was daring Nicky to stop her. Nicky looked away. Behind them, the black shirts were drawing ever closer. Already the first few boats were rounding the tip of the pier.
"We have to go,"
Nicky said. "We only have—"
"I'm not leaving him,"
Avery shouted. Nicky put a hand on her arm, but Avery slapped it away. Nicky drew her hand back, stunned. "Avery!" But it was too late. Avery turned away and bounded over the gunwale, landing with a splash in the weed-choked water. The next instant she was rushing toward Nate and the zombies gathering around them, her knees churning, water splashing all around her.
"Avery, no!"
One last glance at the river. The black shirts were coming. The window was closing. A sudden calm dropped over Nicky, and her options appeared before her as though laid out on a chart. This was her gift, she knew, the ability to focus when everyone else around her was losing their minds. And in that moment, the pain in her ribs was gone. The pain of Sylvia dead by her hand was gone. There was only the choice: save Avery or save herself and the cure. She couldn't do both. But it really wasn't a choice at all. It never had been. She slung the rifle over her shoulder and went over the side. Avery had already reached Nate, and she was trying to pull him into the water, but she could barely lift him. Nicky stepped in beside her, her hands under Nate's arms, and quickly pulled him back. His body was slick with mud and blood, but once they got him to deeper water, it was easier to hold him up. "Get in the boat," she said to Avery. "I'll hand him up to you." Avery grabbed the top of the gunwale and pulled herself up as far as she could. The zombies were entering the water behind them. "Come on, Avery."
"I'm trying."
Nicky eased Nate down onto her knee to keep his head above water. Then she hugged Avery's legs and pushed her over the edge of the boat. Nate was unconscious now, dead weight, and he was harder to lift. But Nicky managed to get her arms around his thighs and hoisted him up. A woman splashed her way toward them, out ahead of the rest of the zombies. Nicky still had her arms around Nate while Avery fumbled with him up above.
"You're gonna have to lift him, Avery. I got company down here." "I'm trying. Lift him higher."
"I can't." Grunting with the effort, fighting against the pain in her ribs, she shoved Nate upward. It was enough. Avery got him by the arms and pulled him over the side, both of them falling to the deck in a heap. Just in time, too. The woman was only a few feet away now. Nicky shrugged the rifle off her shoulder and swung it butt first into the woman's face, her teeth shattering with a sickening crunch. Then she sagged into the water, coughing while she sank beneath the surface. Nicky watched her fall, feeling numb inside. More zombies were coming, but suddenly all the hatred was gone. She didn't feel fear or rage. The hunger to kill those slavering things was gone. She just felt tired. Wincing, she clambered into the boat. Avery had pulled Nate onto one of the forward bench seats, a smear of blood and mud across the white deck marking his path. Nicky scrambled past her and got behind the wheel. She fed the throttle and turned the boat into deeper water, but almost immediately came to a stop. The black shirts were in formation all around them, riflemen leaning over the bows of their boats. They were surrounded. Nicky stared from one man to the next. She watched them adjust their grips on their rifles, and sighed. So close, only to end like this. She coughed blood again. The black shirts stared back at her, their faces impassive, unreadable. Nicky emerged from behind the wheel and walked forward, into the little open area where Avery was still tending to a groaning, unconscious Nate.
"Nicky,"
Avery said. Nicky gestured for her to be still. She stared back at the black shirts, aware of every twitch, every nervous cough. Aware, too, of the moaning and splashing behind her. What were the black shirts waiting for?
"Finish it," she thought. "I would if I were you."
The rain, she noticed then, had slackened off to a fine mist. When had that happened? Strange that she could be so alive to the minute movements of the black shirts, but fail to notice something like that. Strange.
"They're not going to shoot us, are they?"
Avery asked. Nicky startled at having the answers supplied for her so unexpectedly. She had been fighting for so long, and so hard, that something vital had ossified inside her. She was blind, she realized, to anything else but the fight. But once Avery put the truth of it into words, she could see the black shirts glancing nervously up at the red man's body, still hanging over the platform's railing. She could see the questioning glances back and forth between the men. She could see their resolve wavering.
"Tell them to let us go,"
Avery said. Nicky opened her mouth to speak, but the words died in her throat.
"Let us go!"
Avery shouted.
"What are you doing this for? There's no reason for it. He's dead."
Nicky flinched, wanting to tell her to be quiet. But she held her tongue. She was too proud. That was always her problem. It was pride that kept her from letting Stoller's people bring them in all those years ago. And it was pride that made her turn her back on him years later. It was pride, too, that kept her from admitting that the shivering, bleeding shell of a man curled up on the boat's bench seat beside her was the answer to humanity's greatest blight. And it was pride that kept her from pleading for her life now, even when so much beyond their lives was at stake. But Avery's words worked where her pride did not. The black shirts lowered their weapons. It started slowly at first, one or two here and there, but soon they were all lowering their weapons. They said nothing. They didn't have to. A path between the boats zippered open. Beyond, the river, shrouded in mist, waited. Without speaking. She was too afraid to speak, as though her voice might crack and expose the brittle weakness she felt within her. Nicky went back to the controls and fed the throttle. They glided through the black shirt flotilla, and the black shirts all lowered their eyes as they went by.
"It's another few miles downriver,"
Avery said. She was sitting next to Nate, who had finally and mercifully passed out, damping a wet rag against his forehead.
"It'll be on the east bank.
You'll recognize the right spot when we come to it?" Avery just nodded. She went on mopping Nate's forehead and brushing the sweat from his eyes. Immune or not, Nicky thought, he wasn't doing well. Despite the rain and dragging him through the river, he was filthy with mud, and the parts of him that weren't muddy were running with blood. There were slashes on his face and deep bruises and bite marks on his chest and arms. The zombies had literally torn him to shreds. He was shivering, too. Even unconscious, he was groaning in pain. "Shh," Avery said. She was cradling her head against her stomach, and watching her, Nicky thought of something that happened a long time before. Before the compound, while the two of them were still wandering the ruins of their little town, and living off scraps left behind by the rape gangs and the hunters. They had taken shelter for the night in the map room of a library because, even then, Avery loved her maps. "You need anything?" Nicky had said, and waited. Nothing. The girl had a map of St. Louis spread out across the floor, and she was rocking back and forth while she quietly chanted the names of streets and parks and railroad lines, burying them deep in the labyrinthine minds of her brain. "I'll be back in a sec, okay? I'm just going to scout around a bit." Nicky waited again, but there was no reply. She turned away, frustrated, angry that she'd been stuck in this world, everything she loved taken from her, and that she'd been left with the custody of this kid who rarely talked and had no interest in anything outside of reading maps. She went out, intending only to look around a bit and come right back. And so she'd wandered the stacks looking for books on killing. As it turned out, there was a bunch. People liked to kill, and people liked to write about it. She opened a book on the tunnel rats of Vietnam and became engrossed, mesmerized by the killing power of men pushed to the limits. Only then did she hear Avery's screams. She drew the pistol and ran for the map room. Crashing through the door, she saw Avery on the ground, on her back, struggling weakly against a man kneeling between her legs, trying to pull her pants down. Two more were standing over her, eyes wide with lust and something akin to hunger, mouths open in anticipation of their turn. They looked up in time to catch a bullet between their eyes. The man between Avery's legs lunged to one side for his shotgun, but Nicky was faster. Her first kick caught the man in the solar plexus, knocking him onto his back, where he gasped for breath like a fish tossed on the shore. She stomped on his throat. She rammed her heel into his nose, breaking it. She threw him on his back and mounted his chest and slammed the pistol butt down on his mouth, sending kernels of teeth skittering across the wooden floor. Again she hit him. Again and again and again. The skin of his face split open. Blood flew everywhere. The man's hands had groped bootlessly against her shoulders, but now even those efforts ceased. He was nothing but a meat puppet, jerking and twittering beneath her blows. There was a thrill, a giddy joy in it. Release. The more she beat on him, the more the rage seemed to change into something that was beyond sexual. She snarled and screamed and howled, as though in the act of killing she might actually negate herself and make this horrible world that wasn't worth a damn go away. And then it was over. She stopped hitting, the rage ebbing away from her so slowly, its leaving was almost painful. And the only sound was Avery's sobbing. The red cloud that had dropped down over her eyes was gone, and in its place was responsibility and obligation and 1,000 other things that seemed like grown-up jobs. She was 20 years old, for Christ's sake. It wasn't fair. It wasn't. But the job was hers, and she couldn't.
He'll be okay?
Nikki shook her head, sending the memory into the recesses of her mind. Avery was looking at her expectantly.
Will he be okay?
Nikki's eyes flicked to Nate, taking in his shivers, his foot that was obviously limp and probably broken. "We need to get him to Dr. Fisher," she said. "He's hurt pretty bad." Avery started to speak, then suddenly stood up and pointed toward the shore.
"Look," she said. "You see that?"
Nikki squinted through the mist covering the river. Up ahead she saw a piece of river trash. White fiberglass, maybe, caught up in the weeds. The humps of what looked like two human bodies were curled up behind it, not moving.
"What is that?"
Avery asked. Nikki went back to the captain's chair and turned the boat toward it. "What do you see?" she asked Avery.
"Keep going,"
Avery said. She was leaning over the edge of the boat, frowning at the bodies.
"We're almost there."
"What is it?"
"I don't know."
She turned back to Nikki.
"We're almost there. Just a little closer."
Nikki stood up, trying to see over the windscreen. "Tell me what you—" Suddenly, Avery screamed. Nikki was beside her in a second, her rifle pointed over the gunwale. Jimmy Hinton was staring back at her over the sights of his own AR-15. Nikki let out the breath she'd been holding and lowered her weapon. Jimmy did the same. That was when she noticed that Gabby was holding what looked like an iPad inside a Ziploc baggie. Nikki nodded toward it.
"What do you have there?"
They motored downriver. Around dusk, Avery spotted an access bridge spanning the river and told Nikki to pull over.
"That's the main road into town," she said. "If we climb up here, it should take us almost all the way to the cemetery."
"Okay. Why did Fisher want you to meet him in Chester?" Jimmy asked from the back of the boat. He and Gabby were shivering when she pulled them from the river, and had stayed under a blanket most of the way downriver. Nikki shrugged. "I don't know. Seems like a strange choice to me. The place has been a ghost town since the outbreak." Nikki did her best to disguise her irritation. She had come this far south on a few occasions, on scavenging missions before the free market at Herculaneum got going, and she remembered how the river could take on a cathedral-like stillness if you let it. It could be beautiful, the fog pooling in the gaps between the trees, creeping over the water. The whole world glazed orange and red by the sunset. One of nature's miracles. Jimmy Hinton and his wife had been quiet enough after Nikki pulled them from the river. But the farther they got from the red man's compound, the more he started to chatter. She was tempted to toss him over the side again, let him talk to the alligators. Instead, she guided the boat to the bank and grounded it on the grass. It heaved back and settled, and she cut the engine. "You're sure he meant this place?" he asked again. "I'm sure," Nikki said. "We're in the right place." "But why? There's nothing down here. And I mean nothing. Just empty buildings and empty houses. Seems to me if you were going to develop some kind of cure, you'd want to go someplace like Cape Girardeau, where they got hospitals and stuff." "Cape Girardeau is crawling with zombies," Nikki said. "You know what I mean. At least down there they got facilities to work with. Maybe there ain't nobody left to work in those hospitals, but they would have the stuff left behind. Stuff you could use to work on a cure." Nikki's temper was starting to rise, but she forced it back down. "He said to meet him here, in Chester, at sunset." "Okay," he said, and held up his hands in mock surrender. "I'm just saying it's not the smartest choice there is." "Next time perhaps somebody will bother to ask your opinion first." "Hey!" Jimmy protested, but she ignored him. Two zombies were walking along the rail line that ran parallel to the river. A moment later, they saw the little boat and started down the grass. Nikki grabbed a wooden club she found on the boat and went up to meet them. "Why don't you just shoot them?" Jimmy called after her. Nikki kept walking. She reached the zombies, and as she bashed their heads in, she wondered about what Jimmy had been saying a moment before, about Chester being empty. Why had Fisher chosen this place? It really was a ghost town. The people who had lived here had fled as the zombies busted out of the quarantine zone down in Texas years before, and no one had bothered to return. It had gone untouched since then. One of the silent towns that stood like haunted memorials of a world long dead and gone. Though she'd never met Fisher in person, she had traded a number of messages with him over the last year. At first, their dealings were businesslike, short and to the point. But soon his personality crept in. She realized he had a playful streak, that his brilliant mind had a penchant for metaphor and symbols. Meeting here, in Chester, a place famous for its desolation, would not have been an accidental choice on his part. Its emptiness would not have gone unnoticed. Why had she not asked herself that before? One of the zombies groaned weakly, and Nicky clubbed it again, this time making sure it was dead, its skull shattered and smashed. She stood over the body, considering the violence that she had carried with her in this world. She had been as empty of mercy as this place was of life. But she stopped there, coughing, touching her ribs gingerly, and smiled, for she thought she finally understood Fisher's joke. She shook her head and went down to the boat to help Avery carry Nate to the cemetery. It wasn't far to St. Mary's Cemetery, a few miles, but between carrying Nate and the mounting pain in her sides, it felt like a long walk. Avery was on the other side of Nate, supporting as much of his weight as she could, but Nicky was doing most of the work. It was fortunate, Nicky thought, that the idiot had nearly starved to death before running into Sylvia and Avery. She couldn't imagine what it would be like to carry a well-fed man in her current condition. Night had already fallen when they crested a rise in the road and found themselves at the entrance to St. Mary's Cemetery. Silvered moonlight glinted off the tops of white tombstones poking up above a sea of overgrown grass and tangled shrubs. In the distance, toward the back of the cemetery, was a white barn-like building with a green metal roof, the one Fisher had told her about. Getting back there through the tangled brush that had grown up between the tombstones was going to be hard, especially carrying Nate. But she didn't see that she had much choice. "This is the place?" Jimmy asked. He and Gabby had fallen in behind them on the walk over from the river, and he had been quiet until now. Nicky nodded. "I don't see anybody." "We're late," Nicky said. "I was supposed to meet him here at sunset." "Yeah, well, it's past that now." Nicky fought down the urge to knock the man's teeth down his throat. And if she hadn't had Nate's limp weight resting on her shoulder, she might not have been able to resist. "How do you know he's even still here?" Jimmy asked. Nicky turned her head enough to give him a hard look, then forced herself back under control. "He has a family with him," she said. "They'll need a place to bed down for the night." "And you think they'll do it in a graveyard?" Nicky's fingers curled into a fist. She had despised him before, when he dumped all that beef bound for the compound. But now that she'd spent a day in his company, she was ready to punch him in the throat and watch him choke to death on his own broken windpipe. It would be easy to do, the blade of her right hand below his Adam's apple. Her pulse quickened just thinking about it. "Jimmy," Gabby said, resting a warning hand on his arm. He caught her eye. "What did I say?" he asked her. But to his credit, he kept quiet after that. Nicky turned back to the graveyard, and her laughter caught her unexpectedly. Avery looked at her, but Nicky just smiled. Unwittingly, Jimmy Hinton had asked just the right question. Fisher had known what he was doing in choosing this place. Here, where life ended, he was planning to show her a cure that had the chance of a new beginning. She laughed again, wondering what he would think of the cure she was bringing him. They entered the graveyard and followed an overgrown trail between leaning headstones. Suddenly, Nate groaned.
"Easy, Nate," Nicky said. "We're almost there." "They'd better be," she thought.
His skin was a furnace. No telling what kind of infection he'd caught from all those bites and scratches. He groaned again.
"Something's wrong with him,"
Avery said. Nicky shifted her weight to lay him down, but Nate fought her.
"No,"
he said. His voice was weak, still little more than a groan.
"What is it?"
Nicky asked.
"Over there. Look."
He could barely lift his hand to point, but Nicky could see it now. Something moving in the shadows. Something big. At first she couldn't figure out what it was, but then its head came up, and another one behind it.
"Horses,"
Avery said. Nicky smiled at the delight in Avery's voice. The girl had always loved horses. The first animal regarded them for a long moment as it chewed its dinner, perhaps pondering if they were zombies or not, and then dipped its head back into the grass between the tombstones.
"They're so pretty,"
Avery said.
"Yeah, they are,"
Nicky agreed. She looked around. Nothing but grass waving in the evening breeze.
"Hello," she called out. "Anybody out there?"
"Hey," Jimmy said, his voice a harsh whisper.
"What the hell are you doing?"
"Relax," Nicky said. "If there were any zombies around here, they would have already spooked those horses. And besides, my contacts told me that Fisher is crippled. He uses a horse-drawn cart to get around in. I bet he's around here somewhere." She looked around again, more hopeful now.
"Hello? Dr. Fisher?"
A dark figure rose up from the grass about 20 feet ahead of them. There was enough moonlight for Nicky to see it was a young man in his early 20s. He had a shotgun pointed at them.
"Are you Eddie or Jason?"
Nicky said. The man lowered the muzzle of his shotgun just a tad.
"I'm Eddie,"
he said. He nodded off to Nicky's right.
"That's Jason over there."
A man with a pump-action shotgun rose up from behind a tombstone.
Good tactics,
Nicky thought. The two men had them in a classic killing funnel, and she hadn't seen it coming. She must really be tired.
"You Nicky Booth?"
Eddie said.
"Yep, that's me."
"You're late."
"It's been a hell of a trip."
"What's wrong with your friend there?"
"He's sick,"
Nicky said.
"It's a long story."
"Wait a minute," Eddie said. "Hey, Jason, that's the guy from the river, the one with the flu."
"No kidding?"
The one named Jason squinted at him.
"Wow, you're right. God, he looks even worse than the last time we saw him. What happened to him?"
"He got hurt," Nicky said.
"You sure he's not infected? He looks like he got tore up."
"He's not infected," Nicky said.
"You mind if I see your dad now? I got a lot to talk to him about."
Eddie lowered his shotgun and motioned for Jason to do the same.
"Sure," he said. "You guys come on. It's this way."
Fisher was lying on the grass, his useless legs stretched out beside him. His children, the two little girls and the youngest boy, were farther off, with their mother. But when Nicky and the others entered the circle of light from their campfire, they all inched closer.
"Dr. Fisher?"
Nicky said. He nodded. "Are you Nicky?"
"In the flesh."
"Based on your reputation, I was expecting somebody taller." Nicky laughed, then winced at the pain in her ribs. "You're hurt," Fisher said.
"Yeah, pretty bad, too. I think I broke my ribs."
"And your friend there, too, it looks like."
"Hey, Dad,"
Eddie said from behind them.
"That's the guy from the river, the one that had the flu."
"Really?" He studied Nate anew. "Well, I'll be. Here, Nicky, set him down here. I'll look at you both." Nicky put Nate down and sat down next to him. All at once the exhaustion overwhelmed her. All she wanted to do was fall asleep. Fisher crawled over to Nate and squinted at his injuries. Then his face hardened. "This man's been bitten," he said. "You brought an infected man into our camp." Eddie and Jason moved in immediately, weapons up.
"No,"
Nikki said. Quickly she explained. She told them about Nate's immunity, and the flash drive, and about the Red Man's death. Eddie and Jason didn't look like they believed any of it. But Fisher was different. The suspicion was already leaving his expression. "You say the Red Man's dead?"
"Nate here killed him."
"And you say he's immune to the necrosis filovirus?" His eyes flickered in the firelight. "Fully immune?" Nikki turned to Gabby.
"Let him see it,"
she said. Gabby took the iPad out of its plastic baggie. She handed it over to Fisher. "What's this?" he said, taking it.
"That's the cure,"
Nikki said. Half smiling, Fisher ran his finger along the edge until he found the device's on switch. "I used to have one of these," he said. "God, I loved mine. Used it all the time. Remember, honey?" His wife was kneeling next to him.
"I remember."
"This one's got a lot of videos on it," Fisher said. "Still works, though. A little cracked, but... Hello. Here it is." His face took on a milky hue in the glow of the iPad screen. His eyes moved across the text, not blinking. "Who authored this?" Nikki looked at Avery.
"Nate said the man's name was Dr. Kellogg,"
Avery answered.
"I didn't catch his first name."
Fisher shook his head. "Never heard of him." He studied the display again, dragging more of the text onto the screen. "No," he said to himself. I wasn't going this way at all." He shook his head. "Not at all. But this is a vaccine, not a cure. My God, this is brilliant." Nikki felt his pulse pounding.
"You think it'll work? You can use that?"
Fisher took a deep breath. He was still smiling, still a little stunned. "Yes," he said. "I mean, if we were able to produce this in quantity and vaccinate people—" His attention went elsewhere for a moment. Then a smile lit the corner of his mouth. "Yes," he said. "Yes, this'll work." He looked at her. "We can do this!" Chapter 32. Hobbling along on crutches, bandages all over his body, Nate propped the iPad up on top of a tombstone and sat down on the marker opposite it. He scratched at a sticky spot on his neck where the bandage had separated, coughed, and cleared his throat. He drew in a ragged breath and started speaking.
"Hi, I'm Nate Royal. This isn't my computer. Well, I guess it is now. Before me, it belonged to this guy named Ben Richardson, who was one of the two smartest men I've ever known. Ben used to be a reporter for a magazine. I don't remember which one, and I guess at this point it doesn't really matter. Before everything pretty much went down the toilet, Ben set out to write the whole history of the zombie outbreak. Things went south on him before he got a chance to finish, but he didn't give up. He went on collecting stories. For 8 long years he wandered this used-up garbage dump of a world we live in, collecting stories from everyone he met. "Nate!" It was Avery, calling to him from the clearing that Nate and the others had been sharing with Fisher and his family for the last week, while everyone mended. He waved to her. "Over here, Avery!" He turned back to the iPad. Where was I? Oh, yeah, stories. Ben believed that stories were the glue that held us together. He said they were as much a part of us as the blood in our veins, and that we needed them just as much. For him, getting somebody to tell their story was as natural as breathing. He had this crazy dream that one day, when the zombies were all gone, All the survivors would gather round, and the stories they told would reshape the world into something better than it was. He thought humanity was something wonderful. He thought that we naturally went to the good, that we listened to the better angels of our nature. I don't know about that. I haven't done a lot of listening to my better angels during my time on this globe of ours. But like I said, Ben was a better man than me. And he said that stories were like a magic mirror that showed us what was best about ourselves. Maybe that's true. I don't know. But I do know that his eyes used to shine when he talked about it. He really believed it. It wasn't just words to him. Stories were his religion. And for him, collecting them was the most holy thing a man could do. It makes me sick to my stomach to think that the world's got to count on me for that now.
He shook his head, coughed. Everything hurt. Nate straightened and blinked away the pain. This was for posterity. It had to be good. He said,
I think about the two great men I've known in my life, Ben Richardson, who I just told you about, and Dr. Mark Kellogg, who used my blood to figure out a vaccine for the zombie virus. And I want to weep for all that we've lost. So much goodness. So many great minds. Just gone.
He smiled bitterly and shrugged.
The world is passing on to mediocre men who remember great men. We are only echoes of them, and not very good ones. Nate!
Avery called to him. She was coming up behind him, breathing hard from the climb up the hill.
You almost ready? Dr. Fisher says we need to get going before the day gets too hot. Yep,
he said.
Almost.
He focused on the iPod again.
Time to wrap this up. This is Ben's book that I'm trying to finish here. So I might as well leave you with something Ben said to me a few days before he died. He said, we all do the best we can, and that most of the time that's good enough to get the job done. And if it doesn't do the trick, well, we still own it. We may have lost the old world, but that doesn't mean we can't find a new one. We just stagger on, zombie-like, one foot in front of the other, and trust we'll get there eventually. And you know what? I think we will.
He shrugged, then smiled.
That's it. That's all the wisdom I got.
He leaned forward and tapped the screen to stop recording. Avery, wearing a sundress borrowed from Dr. Fisher's wife, stopped a short way off and waited for him.
What are you doing up here?
She asked. He turned. Richardson was standing on a small rise behind her, facing east, watching a golden haze looming in the trees down by the road.
Ben!
Avery followed his gaze. Her brow wrinkled.
You okay?
She asked.
What are you doing up here?
Nate stood, favoring his broken ankle as he slid the crutches under his arms.
Can you help me with the iPad?
He asked.
Sure.
She tucked it under her arm and stood next to him.
Can I help you? Yeah, that'd be nice. Thanks. You didn't tell me what you were doing up here.
He gestured at the iPad with his chin.
Just finishing up something for Ben. Something I promised I'd do.
She smiled uncertainly, as though she didn't quite know what to say.
Are you ready to go? Dr. Fisher wants to go.
He looked over at the next rise, but Ben was gone. To Avery, he said,
Yeah, I'm all set.
And together, the two of them walked down to the camp in the late morning sun. This concludes Mutated,